Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. We are going to be tackling something a little bit different today.
A little bit different.
Yeah, and I am excited about this one because it's a chance for us to really look at um, the way we think about a certain topic
Okay.
and maybe challenge some of our assumptions. And that topic is autism research. But we're not just looking at the science itself.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually going a little deeper and examining the system surrounding that research.
That's really interesting.
So like who's doing the research, who's it benefiting, and yeah, just kind of like a behind the scenes look.
I like a behind-the-scenes look at the whole system.
Yeah,
Because I think sometimes we get really caught up in the what of research,
right.
but we don't always stop to ask, who's asking the question from the first place.
Exactly. And what are their motivations and, who's actually benefiting from the findings. So that's what we're going to dive into today.
Hey, excited?
Yeah, and the article we're using as our kind of jumping off point is called Able Grounded Phenomenology, Ethical Research for Autistic Lives. And I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's about a new research framework called Able Grounded Phenomenology, or AGP.
AGT.
AGP, yeah. And it's kind of shaking things up in the autism field.
It's really challenging the traditional way of doing things, right?
Yeah, it's like a wake-up call in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and it's pushing for a more ethical and inclusive approach to research.
Okay, so let's get into it. The article starts by talking about, the problems with traditional autism research, and it doesn't mince words.
No, it definitely does not.
It's very direct.
And I think one of the main critiques is that traditional research often uses what's called a deficit-based model.
Okay.
So basically, it looks at autism as a bunch of flaws or deficits that need to be fixed instead of just differences in how people experience the world.
Yeah, I mean, that word fixing really rubs me the wrong way.
I understand.
If we're always talking about fixing autistic people, what does that say about how we see them?
Yeah, that's a really profound question.
Right. Are we trying to, like, genuinely support them, or are we trying to, like, put them in a box and make them fit into our idea of normal?
It's almost like you're saying you're not acceptable as you are, you need to change.
Exactly. And I think that's a really dangerous message.
Absolutely. And it can lead to interventions that are more about enforcing conformity than about genuine support.
Right. Like, we're going to try and force you to make eye contact, even if that's incredibly uncomfortable for you. Or we're going to try and, get you to suppress your stimming behaviors, even though that might be a way that you regulate your sensory input.
Yeah, and that can have long-term consequences on mental health and well-being.
Absolutely. So the article gives this example of a study on something called the Emotional Recognition Memory Training Program.
ERMTP.
ERMTP, yeah, it's a mouthful. And it was this program that was supposed to help autistic children improve their ability to recognize emotions.
Okay, interesting.
But the article points out some major flaws in the study itself.
Like what kind of flaw?
Well, for one thing, it had a really small sample size.
Mm-hmm.
It relied on data reported by parents, which can be subjective, right? Like, parents aren't necessarily the most objective observers of their own children.
That's true.
And then the big one, it didn't even have a control group.
Oh, wow.
So how can you really say if any changes you see are due to the intervention or just, random chance?
Right. Without a control group, you can't really isolate the effects of the intervention.
Exactly. And then even beyond the scientific issues, what about just the bigger picture? What's the potential harm in trying to improve emotional recognition this way?
That's a great question.
Right? Because, I mean, I can see how someone might say, well, it's helpful for autistic people to be able to understand other people's emotions. But then the other time of that is like, are we just putting pressure on them to mask their natural responses?
Exactly.
To, like, pretend to be more neurotypical?
Try and appear more neurotypical even if it's not authentic to who they are.
And, like, how sustainable is that? How long can you keep up that kind of performance?
Right, and that constant masking can be exhausting, and it can really have negative impacts on mental health and well-being.
It's like you're constantly on edge. You're constantly having to monitor yourself and make sure you're performing the right way. And that takes a toll.
It does, and that's where Able Grounded Phenomenology comes in.
Okay, tell me more.
It's a different approach altogether. It's
Right,
not
right.
about trying to change autistic people. It's about understanding and valuing their lived experiences.
Okay, so instead of starting with this idea that something is wrong,
Right.
AGP wants to hear from autistic people themselves.
Absolutely.
About what their needs are and what kind of research would actually benefit them.
It draws from phenomenology, which is a way of understanding lived experience.
Okay.
But instead of relying on a researcher's interpretation, it centers the autistic person's perspective.
That's a big shift.
It is.
So instead of, focusing on how to make autistic people read emotions better, what kind of questions does AGP research ask?
Oh, that's a good question. I like that a lot.
Yeah, can you give us an example?
Yeah, so an AGP researcher might ask, What are the sensory experiences of autistic people in crowded spaces?
Okay.
Or how do autistic people navigate social interactions in ways that feel authentic to them? It's about understanding their reality, not trying to fit them into a predetermined mold.
That makes so much more sense.
It does.
And it seems like for this to work, for AGP to work, you really need to have autistic people involved in the research process itself,
Absolutely.
not just as like subjects,
Right.
but as collaborators.
Exactly. AGP prioritizes involving autistic people in every stage of the research process.
Wow. Okay. So it's like they're helping to decide what questions to ask.
Right.
They're helping to design the studies.
Yes.
They're helping to interpret the findings.
Absolutely. It's about collaboration, not just studying people from a distance.
Okay. So this is really interesting. AGP really flips the script on how research is done, but what does that actually look like in practice?
I'm glad you asked that.
What kind of projects are happening right now?
Well, one of the most impactful examples is the work of Dr. Henny Kupferstein,
Okay.
who is the autistic psychologist who developed AGP.
Oh, wow. So she's actually autistic herself.
Yes, and she did an audit of the UC Davis Mind Institute,
What?
which is a prominent autism research center, and her findings were pretty shocking.
Wait, an audit, like a financial audit?
Well, it was more of an ethical audit.
Okay.
Dr. Kupferstein looked at how the Mind Institute was using public funds
Uh-huh.
and whether their research aligned with the needs and priorities of the autistic community, and what she found was this huge disconnect.
Like a disconnect between what the research was doing and what autistic people actually needed.
Exactly.
Okay, so tell me more about this audit. I'm really curious. Like, what did she find?
Well, one of the things she found was that a lot of public money was going towards animal studies
Okay.
that had very little relevance to autistic people.
So like they were studying mice or rats or something.
Exactly, like studying gait patterns in mice to try and understand autism.
Gait patterns, like how they walk.
Yeah.
How is that even connected?
Well, that's exactly the kind of question that AGP raises, right?
Right.
Can we really understand a complex human experience like autism by studying animals?
And more importantly, is that the best use of resources when there are so many other research questions that could directly benefit autistic people?
Exactly, and the audit went even deeper than that.
Really?
It looked at the whole system surrounding autism research.
So like who's funding the research, who's doing the research, and who's profiting from it?
Precisely, that's right.
Okay, this is getting juicy.
The audit used this really interesting infographic
Uh-huh.
to show how funding flows from organizations like the National Institutes of Health.
Okay, big funding bodies?
Yeah, to institutions like the Mind Institute, and then the research that comes out of these institutions often reinforces the funders' priorities.
Even if those priorities don't align with what the autistic community actually needs.
That's right, it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle.
And the article suggests that this whole system is actually fueled by capitalism, where everything, even human neurodiversity, can be commodified
Absolutely.
and exploited for profit.
It's about making money off of autism.
So like we see this with the proliferation of therapies and interventions that are marketed to parents as like the essential thing you need to do for your autistic child.
Right, and those products are often coming from the same institutions that are benefiting from the research funding.
So the research itself becomes a way to justify the existence of these products.
Exactly, and AGP really challenges this whole system.
How?
By demanding transparency and accountability. It says, let's look at where the money's going
Right.
and whether it's actually helping autistic people.
So it's about shifting the power dynamic, putting the needs of the autistic community first.
Exactly.
I love that.
Yeah, it's a really radical shift in perspective.
It's not just about tweaking the system. It's about completely changing the way we think about autism and the purpose of research.
Yeah, and that's what's so revolutionary about AGP. It's not just about autism research.
Uh-huh.
It's about challenging systems of power and advocating for social justice.
That's a big statement.
It is.
It makes you wonder what other fields could benefit from an approach like this.
Oh, I think a lot of fields could benefit from a decolonial approach like AGP.
Yeah, where are we perpetuating harmful narratives and systems of oppression under the guise of research or support?
Right, like where are we doing things? Because we've always done them that way.
Without really stopping to question.
Without stopping to question if it's actually helping the people we're trying to help.
Right. And who's benefiting from these systems?
It's a question worth asking in all sorts of areas.
Absolutely.
Whenever we're dealing with marginalized communities, we need to be really careful about our assumptions
Right.
and make sure that our research is actually helping the people it's supposed to be helping.
You know what's really striking me as we're talking about all this is the ethical dimension of AGP.
Yeah,
It's not just about doing research differently. It's about doing research the right way.
absolutely. Ethics is at the core of AGP.
It's about respecting the autonomy and dignity of autistic individual.
And ensuring that research is conducted in a way that benefits the community.
Not just researchers or institutions.
Exactly.
And speaking of power dynamics, that infographic from Dr. Kupferstein's audit really drives the point home, doesn't it?
It does.
It shows how interconnected everything is
Uh-huh.
and how easily money and influence can shape the direction of research.
That infographic is a powerful tool for understanding how the autism industrial complex operates.
The autism industrial complex, that's a great term.
Yeah, Dr. Kupferstein coined that term.
And it's not just about individual researchers or institutions. It's about a whole system that often prioritizes profit over the well-being of autistic people.
That's right.
As we're talking about this, I can't help but think about how AGP aligns with the broader neurodiversity movement.
I was thinking the same thing.
It's about celebrating neurological differences, not trying to erase them.
That's a really important connection.
Yeah.
AGP and the neurodiversity movement share a common goal.
Which,
To create a world where autistic people can thrive as their authentic selves.
without pressure to conform to neurotypical norms.
Right.
I love that.
It's a beautiful vision.
And it makes you wonder, what would it take to actually shift the balance of power in autism research?
That's the million-dollar question.
How do we move from a system that often sees autistic people as problems to be solved to a system that sees them as partners
Exactly.
in creating a better future?
That's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Excited, can't
We're
learn.
going to look at the challenges and opportunities of implementing AGP,
Okay,
the potential impact on autistic lives, and what each of us can do to support this movement.
so stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back
After a short break,
to continue this conversation.
about Able Grounded Phenomenology. It's interesting, right? We were talking about how research can be shaped by the assumptions of the people doing the research.
Yeah, and how those assumptions can have, like, real-world consequences.
Yeah, and sometimes those consequences can be harmful.
And the article actually makes this connection between traditional autism research and some pretty, like, dark moments in history.
Yeah, it's not afraid to go there.
No, it's like they're saying, hey, we need to acknowledge this stuff.
Absolutely. We can't just sweep it under the rug.
So what are some of those connections?
Well, the article talks about how in the past, autistic individuals were often viewed as objects to be studied and controlled, rather than as people with their own unique perspectives and experiences.
Right, like they were seen as problems to be fixed.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking has roots in things like colonialism and eugenics, where certain groups of people were seen as inferior or defective and needed to be eliminated or at least controlled.
It's like this idea that difference equals deficiency.
Yeah, and that's a really dangerous way of thinking because it can lead to all sorts of harmful practices.
And those practices can have lasting effects on how society views and treats autistic people.
Exactly. It's not just about the past, it's about how those ideas continue to shape our present.
And that's why AGP is so important, because it represents a clear break from that legacy.
It does. It's like a rejection of that whole way of thinking.
It's like saying, no, we're not going to treat autistic people as problems to be solved.
We're going to listen to them, we're going to learn from them, and we're going to work together to create a world where they can thrive.
I love that. And it seems like that infographic from Dr. Kupferstein's audit really illustrates how that old way of thinking is still operating today.
Oh, absolutely. That infographic is so powerful because it shows how funding flows from these large organizations like the National Institutes of Health to institutions like the Mind Institute.
Right. And those institutions then conduct research that aligns with the funder's priorities.
Exactly, even if those priorities don't necessarily reflect the needs of the autistic community.
So it's like this self-perpetuating cycle. The funders are supporting research that confirms their existing biases, and then that research is used to justify more funding for the same kind of research.
And the whole time, the actual lived experiences of autistic people are being ignored.
And their voices are being silenced.
Exactly, and as the article points out, this whole system thrives under capitalism where everything, even human neurodiversity, can be commodified and exploited for profit.
That's right. It's like autism becomes a product to be marketed and sold.
And the people who suffer are autistic individuals themselves.
So how does AGP try to break this cycle?
Well, it starts by demanding transparency and accountability. It's about saying, okay, let's look at where the money is going and let's make sure that it's actually benefiting autistic people.
So it's about shifting the focus from profits to people.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that autistic people are the experts on their own experiences.
So instead of trying to speak for them,
we need to listen to them.
And involve them in every stage of the research process.
Absolutely, from deciding what questions to ask to interpreting the results.
The article uses this really powerful phrase it calls embracing AGP an anti-colonial intervention.
I love that phrase.
Me too. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Sure. So when we talk about colonialism, we're talking about a system of power where one group of people asserts dominance over another group, And that dominance is often justified through ideas of superiority or inferiority.
And the article is suggesting that traditional autism research, with its focus on deficits and cures, is perpetuating that same kind of power dynamic.
Exactly. It's positioning researchers and institutions as the experts who know what's best for autistic people.
And AGP is saying, no, we need to dismantle that power structure.
We need to recognize that autistic people have their own knowledge and expertise to contribute.
It's about moving from a paradigm of control to a paradigm of empowerment.
Absolutely. And I think that shift has implications that go way beyond just the field of autism research.
So how does this all relate to our listeners? Why should they care about Able Grounded Phenomenology?
Well, for one thing, AGP offers a framework for thinking about ethical research and social justice, not just in the context of autism, but in any field where we're studying human experience.
Right? It's about asking ourselves, are we approaching this research in a way that respects the dignity and autonomy of the people we're studying?
Are we centering their voices? Are we making sure that our research is actually contributing to a more just and equitable world?
It's a reminder that knowledge isn't neutral. It's always embedded in power dynamics, and we have a responsibility to use our knowledge ethically and in service of those who have been historically marginalized.
And in that way, AGI isn't just about research methods, it's about values.
It's about valuing diversity, respecting autonomy, and prioritizing the well-being of the community above all else.
It's about creating a world where everyone can thrive, not just those who fit a narrow definition of normal.
That's a powerful message, and for our listeners who are eager to learn more about AGP and how they can support this movement, we'll provide some resources in the show notes.
I highly encourage everyone to check out Dr. Kupferstein's work and to engage with the growing community of autistic researchers and advocates who are championing this approach.
This is a conversation that needs to continue, and it needs to include all of us. But while AGP offers this powerful vision for the future, I'm wondering, are there any potential downsides or challenges to implementing this approach?
That's a great question, and I think one challenge is that AGP requires a significant shift in mindset and practices within the research community.
So it's not just about adopting new methods, it's about changing the entire culture of research.
Exactly, and that takes time and effort. Another challenge is that AGP research often requires more collaboration and community engagement, which can be more complex and time-consuming than traditional research approaches.
But those challenges seem worth facing if it means creating more ethical and meaningful research.
Absolutely, and ultimately, I think the potential benefits of AGP far outweigh the challenges.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive so far. What stands out to you as we reflect on AGP and its implications?
For me, it's the transformative potential of AGP. It's not about tweaking the existing system. It's about building something entirely new, something that's rooted in justice, equity, and the authentic experiences of autistic people.
And that's something worth striving for.
Absolutely. And in the final part of this deep dive, we'll explore what that future might look like. We'll discuss the implications of AGP for autistic individuals, for the research community, and for society as a whole.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back to wrap up this deep dive into Able Grounded Phenomenology. Welcome back, everybody. We've been talking about Able Grounded Phenomenology and how it's really challenging the status quo in autism research.
Yeah, it's asking some tough questions about how we think about autism and how we do research.
And more importantly, who that research benefits.
Exactly. It's about putting the needs of the autistic community front and center.
So we've talked about the problems with the current system, but let's shift gears a little bit and imagine a future where AGP is really guiding the way we do research.
Ooh, I like that.
What does that world look like?
Well, I think one of the most important changes would be a real shift towards collaborative research.
So instead of researchers kind of coming in and studying autistic people like they're specimens under a microscope,
Right, exactly.
they're actually working alongside autistic people as partners.
Partners in the truest sense of the word.
So autistic people would be involved in every stage of the research process, from coming up with the research questions to actually collecting and analyzing the data.
And interpreting the findings and sharing them with the community.
That's huge.
It's a complete reimagining of the power dynamics in research.
And imagine if funding agencies actually prioritized research that was aligned with the needs of the autistic community.
That would be incredible. Instead of funding studies that focus on, deficits or cures, we could be supporting research that explores autistic strengths and interests.
Research that helps autistic people thrive.
Exactly.
That's what I'm talking about.
And that includes challenging societal barriers, advocating for policies that promote inclusion and accessibility.
It sounds like AGP isn't just about changing research. It's about changing the world.
In a way it is, because research doesn't exist in a vacuum. It shapes how we understand the world and how we interact with each other.
So what can our listeners do if they want to be a part of this change?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to spread the word about AGP, talk to your friends, family, colleagues about it, share the resources we've mentioned on the show.
Let's get people talking about this.
Exactly, because the more people know about AGP, the more likely it is that we'll start seeing real change.
And if you're a researcher, you can start incorporating AGP principles into your own work.
Think critically about the questions you're asking, who you're collaborating with, and how your research can actually benefit the autistic community.
And if you're someone who's involved in funding research, you can push for greater transparency and accountability. Ask how the research is being conducted, who's involved, and how the findings will be used to improve autistic people's lives.
We all have a role to play in making this vision a reality.
We really do. And, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this feeling of hope, but also urgency. AGP offers this incredible path forward, but we need to act now.
I agree. Time is of the essence.
We can't just sit around and wait for things to change. We have to be the change.
And I think AGP gives us the tools to do that.
It shows us how to challenge the status quo, how to center the voices of those who've been marginalized, and how to use research as a force for good.
It's about creating a world that works for everyone, not just a select few.
That's a beautiful vision, and I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Able Grounded Phenomenology.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to think differently about autism research and the power we all have to create a more just and equitable world.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for change. Thanks for listening, everyone.